Thank you very much, Ted. Just as you give me the podium, my phone is ringing. So welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see you all. A lot has changed since the Weatherhead Forum has assembled last in the fall. So we have much to discuss. This is the first session of the Weatherhead Forum for this semester. We will meet 5 times during this semester to feature the work of our research affiliates, but we're also going to have panels on burning topics. The next panel after this one is on meritocracy with Michael Sandel and others. We'll have a panel on sustainability with several of our faculty who work on this topic, and another one that's Sven Beckert is organizing on globalization. So we have much to look forward to. So today, this is a very exciting session. The topic is the current crisis of American democracy, domestic and international implications. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Michèle Lamont. I'm the director of the center, the Weatherhead Center, and the Robert I. Goldman Professor in European Studies and Professor of Sociology and African American Studies. So we have an all-star panel. I'll keep the introduction very short because these panelists don't need an introduction. First, we have Steve Levitsky, who is the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, and he's also the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies in the Department of Government here at Harvard. His collaborator, Dan Ziblatt, Eaton Professor of the Science of Government in the Department of Government at Harvard, and together they are the author of an extremely influential book, How Democracies Die, which I was very happy to see described in The Economist a week or two ago as the most influential book of the last year. So congratulations, dear colleagues. We then have Cynthia Miller-Idriss, a sociologist whose work I've long admired. She is a sociologist of public affairs in the School of Education at American University, and she just published a new book titled Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right. This is building on her previous book, which was a wonderful study of how consumption is used in the German far right to signal identity and to build momentum. And finally, a very dear old friend of mine, Sheri Berman, professor in the Department of Political Science at Barnard College at Columbia. She's the author of Democracy and Dictatorship from the Ancien Régime to Present Day. She's also a frequent collaborator and a contributor to many media that we're all following. So I'll keep this introduction really short, and I'll ask Steve and Dan to share comments. Then I'll ask one question, then we'll turn to Cynthia, again followed by one question, and finally Sheri. And at the very end, we're going to have a Q&A for everyone. So some of our speakers will have to peel off before we're done. Cynthia has to leave at 1, and Sheri a little bit later, so we simply have to do what we can given everyone's responsibilities. So I'll stop here and invite Steve to get us started.
Thanks, Michèle, and thanks to the Weatherhead Center for the invitation and for putting this together. It's a real honor to be part of this tremendous panel. Daniel and I are going to present something together. He and I participated in an event similar to this 4 years ago, just after Trump was elected. And we had just written an op-ed arguing that Trump posed a serious threat to our country's democratic institutions. And at the time, early 2007 or late 2016, people thought we were being a little alarmist. But as it turns out, we probably were not alarmist enough. Turns out Trump was a threat to democratic institutions, but he wasn't the only one. The bulk of the Republican Party has also begun to turn away from democracy. Now, 4 years ago, Daniel and I expected the Republicans to constrain Trump, but instead they enabled and protected him. Republicans were largely silent as Trump worked to purge, to pack, to politicize key agencies from the Justice Department to the Defense Department to Homeland Security. They remained silent as he encouraged violent extremism, including militia groups storming state houses. They protected him from impeachment, and crucially, a striking number of them were complicit in Trump's 2-month-long campaign to overturn the results of the 2020 election. What happened between November 2020 and January 2021 was an attempted presidential coup, what in Latin America we call an autogolpe, a self-coup. And a good chunk of the Republican Party was on board with it. With few exceptions, Republicans refused to publicly recognize Biden's victory or denounce the big lie of a stolen election. Senators like Lindsey Graham pressured state officials to commit fraud. 17 state attorney generals tried to overturn the election in the courts, and a majority of House Republicans refused to certify the election result. So it's not just Trump. By 2020, the entire Republican Party was on the brink of becoming an undemocratic, anti-system party. Now, in his classic book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, the great political scientist Juan Linz laid out some basic criteria for what he called loyal opposition, or for how small d democratic parties ought to behave. For Linz, small d democratic parties must do the following. They must unambiguously commit to achieving power only by electoral means. They must unambiguously commit to surrendering power unconditionally when they lose elections. They must unambiguously reject the use of violence as a means of achieving or maintaining power. They must unambiguously reject appeals to the armed forces as a means of gaining or maintaining power. They must unambiguously reject the use of violent rhetoric. They must avoid secret contact with extremist or anti-democratic groups. They must refuse the support of extremist or anti-democratic groups. And they must never, ever tolerate or condone extremist or anti-democratic behavior carried out by the supporters or by their ideological allies. In fact, Linz argued that democratic parties, small d democratic parties, must be willing to publicly denounce conspiratorial or anti-democratic activities on their own ideological flank. And they must be willing to join forces with ideologically distant opponents, guys on the other side of the aisle, in order to defend democracy against anti-democratic extremists. These, for Linz, were basic criteria for pro-democratic behavior. They were laid out by a guy who spent a good chunk of his career trying to understand how democracy died in Europe in the 1920s and 30s and South America in the 1960s and 70s. And the lessons Linz draws are really clear. Parties must unambiguously reject violence and violent rhetoric, and they must unambiguously break with extremist and anti-democratic forces on their own flank. Now, for Linz, openly authoritarian parties like the fascists were not the only danger. Crucial danger comes from what he called semi-loyal opposition, mainstream, nominally pro-system parties that fail to meet the behavioral criteria that I just laid out. So they don't unambiguously reject violence. They don't avoid violent rhetoric. They maintain contact with extremist forces on their own flank. They maybe accept their support. They tolerate, even condone their behavior, and they refuse to work with other pro-democratic parties to isolate and defeat extremist forces on their flank. This is what the Republican Party has become, a semi-loyal party that is increasingly captured by extremists. So extremists now control several state Republican parties, from Arizona to Oregon to Pennsylvania. Extremists, including politicians who have openly endorsed violence, now sit in Congress. And crucially, Republican leaders, national Republican leaders, are no longer willing to denounce them, much less break with them. Even after the storming of the Capitol, there was no prospect of Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy joining forces with Democrats to isolate Trumpism. Republicans are more likely to isolate or censure Liz Cheney than they are Marjorie Taylor Greene. They will purge the Republican official who voted to certify the results in Michigan. They will not break with Congress people who encourage the storming of the Capitol or endorse the idea of executing the Speaker of the House. These are the marks of an anti-system party, a party that came dangerously close to stealing an election. The Trumpists and their Republican allies spent 2 full months, exploring a range of strategies that could be used to overturn the election results. Having local or state officials throw out ballots from opposition strongholds based on technicalities, having the courts throw out ballots based on technicalities, refusing to certify election results, having state legislatures set aside the popular vote and send alternate slates of electors to the Electoral College under the pretense of fraud. All of those actions that I just mentioned are potentially legal under the Constitution. They could be deemed legal by friendly judges. They are acts of what Daniel and I call constitutional hardball, and yet they are profoundly anti-democratic. They could enable the outright theft of an election. That did not happen in 2020, but we now know that it could happen. Hardball election tactics are now on the table, and Republican behavior, particularly over the last 3 months, makes it clear, at least to me, that somebody's going to reach for those tactics again in the future. All right, how the hell did we get here? It is now pretty common knowledge that American politics has descended into a dangerous level of polarization. Republicans and Democrats have come to literally fear and loathe one another. According to a 2018 Pew survey, 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats said the other party makes them afraid. A more recent survey found that 60% of both Democrats and Republicans believe the other party is a danger to the United States. We have not seen this kind of partisan fear and hatred since Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional left-right polarization. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They are about racial and cultural identity. Our partisan identities, the identities of our parties and partisans, have changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Go back to the 1960s and 1970s, the Republicans and Democrats were culturally, demographically even, pretty similar. Both parties, among other things, were overwhelmingly white and Christian. 3 changes have occurred over the last half century. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic to the Republican Party, while African Americans, in some cases newly enfranchised, became overwhelmingly Democrats. Secondly, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration, first from Latin America, then from Asia. Most of those immigrants and their kids ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, since the beginning of the Reagan era, evangelical Christians have flocked to the Republican Party. So today, the Democrats and the Republicans represent very different communities. Democrats are sort of a rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities, while the Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So Democrats and Republicans today are separated by a set of deep and overlapping cleavages. They look different, they speak different languages, they live in different places, they go to different schools, they pray to different gods. And they have fundamentally different conceptions of what it means to be an American. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracy. When we come to view a victory by our partisan rivals as something that's intolerable, something that's catastrophic, we start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent things like voter suppression, election fraud, even violence. This is what wrecked democracy in Europe in the 1930s and in Chile in the 1970s. Now, the thing is, one thing that separates the United States from Chile and Spain is that US polarization is asymmetric. Only the Republicans have evolved into an anti-system party. Why is that? The answer, we think, is rooted in the Republican base. White Christians are not just any group. Not only were they once an overwhelming electoral majority in this country, but not long ago, my childhood, they occupied the top rung of all of our country's social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchies. They filled the presidency, Congress, Supreme Court, governor's mansion. They were the CEOs, they were the newscasters, the pillars of local communities. Those days obviously are over. But losing not only a majority, but losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And for many, that feels like an existential threat. This is an important point, and I think it lies at the heart of what now threatens our democracy. Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. That means when we lose an election, we accept defeat, we go home, we get drunk, we regroup, and we get up ready to play again the next day. But for parties to follow that norm, for parties to lose graciously, 2 conditions have to hold. First of all, parties have to believe they stand a chance of winning again in the future. And second, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians or their base fear that they won't be able to win future elections, or if they believe that defeat will bring catastrophe, the stakes rise dramatically. Politicians and their activists' time horizons narrow. They throw tomorrow to the wind and try to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation leads politicians and parties to play dirty. Daniel found this dynamic in his research on 19th century German conservatives. German conservatives were terrified in the 19th century at the prospect of expanding the suffrage. For them, giving the workers the right to vote meant not only their own electoral defeat, but the demise of the entire aristocratic order. So the conservatives played dirty. They used fraud and repression to cling to power all the way through World War I. Or think about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment brought widespread Black enfranchisement. African Americans constituted either an outright majority or a near majority in most post-Confederate states. So their enfranchisement, their mass enfranchisement, scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did Black suffrage threaten Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, but it threatened to potentially overturn the entire racial order. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. In 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that enabled the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African American voting rights. Black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. Unwilling to lose, Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule in the US South. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. The Republicans' future electoral prospects as things stand are pretty bleak. They're an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a declining portion of the US electorate. 1992, when I was a graduate student, white Christians were 3/4 of the US electorate. By 2012, they were down to 57%. By the next presidential election, they may be below 50%. To make matters worse, younger voters are overwhelmingly Democrats. But the problem is not just that Republicans face a potentially bleak electoral future. It's that their base has come to view defeat as catastrophic. Again, many Republican voters fear they're on the brink of losing not just elections, but their country. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. So like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. And we've seen this pretty clearly for more than a decade. Since 2010, Republican governments in state after state after state have taken steps to make it harder for younger, lower income, African and minority voters to register and to exercise the vote, closing polling places in predominantly African American neighborhoods, purging voter rolls, making it harder to register. Now, voter suppression was troubling enough, but Republican radicalization accelerated under Trump, and it seems to have gone into overdrive since the 2020 election. We need to come to grips with the fact that the Republicans are becoming an anti-system party. Democracy cannot survive for long if only one party is committed to playing by democratic rules of the game. With that, I turn to Daniel.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here as well. So Steve and I have divided the labor, and he's given me the extra hard part, which is to ask, given what he has just said, and the dilemma and the problem that he's just pointed out, what in the world are we supposed to do about this? Because the challenge of having a political party in a democracy that runs the risk of becoming an anti-system party is deeply threatening to democracy itself. You know, how can a political system premised on openness and tolerance of political opposition deal with an opposition party that seems bent, in at least certain elements of it, on destroying exactly that system? So this is a real bind, a fundamental challenge. Now, the good news is, if we want to call it that, is that we are neither the first country nor the first generation to face this kind of challenge. Indeed, there's actually really 2 centuries of thought on exactly this question of how to deal with an anti-system party within a democracy. And this historical record, in my own reading, I think gives us 2 broad paradigms, I think, to think about this. The first comes out of the calamitous experiences of the middle third of the 20th century. So in the 1930s and the 1940s, the wake of the fascist takeovers of power, often through constitutional means, especially in Germany, this shaped how liberal and democratic thinkers developed constitutional doctrine after 1945, especially again in West Germany. And they developed a notion around, they developed a kind of constitutional doctrine around this notion of wehrhafte Demokratie, or what's often translated as militant or defensive democracy. So the basic notion of militant democracy is developed by Karl Lowenstein, a German emigre political scientist in the 1930s from Germany, who was frustrated and really upset about and decried the passivity of German liberals in the face of the Nazi takeover. So in Lowenstein's view, this was a dramatic mistake to allow fascists to fester in the political system and then to allow them to abuse the constitutional system to come to power. So the quote that haunted Lowenstein and other advocates of militant democracy was actually from Joseph Goebbels himself, who infamously, after the Nazis were in power, had this incredible quote where he said, Goebbels, "This will always remain one of the best jokes of democracy, that it gave its deadly enemies the very means by which it was destroyed." What also haunted Lowenstein and other advocates of militant democracy was the most important senior liberal constitutional scholar of the Weimar era, Hans Kelsen, in 1932, the year before Hitler came to power, warned against violating the constitutional rights of extremists when he wrote, and this again in 1932, Kelsen wrote, "Those who are for democracy cannot allow themselves to be caught in the dangerous contradiction of using the means of dictatorship to defend democracy. One must remain faithful to one's flag, even when the ship is sinking." Now, Kelsen fled Germany shortly after this for the United States and spent the rest of his life in the Berkeley Hills. But this experience convinced post-war German thinkers and jurists that German democracy needed to be defended. So Lowenstein and the architects of post-war Germany thought it was insane to let liberal ideas and illiberal parties to roam freely in a political system if they're not committed to playing by the rules of the game. It'll be an uneven fight because illiberals fight dirty, and so they'll win. So the core idea of militant democracy was that to defend democracy, the state, the coercive apparatus, in a top-down fashion should be used to differentiate acceptable and unacceptable debate, differentiate unacceptable and acceptable political parties, and then after a legal process, ultimately be able to ban dangerous or unacceptable debate or parties. So this militant democracy tradition has been enormously consequential in post-war Germany. It's in the 1949 Constitution. Article 21 allows for the banning of political parties that are deemed as being anti-constitutional, and Article 18, which allows for the limiting of free speech. This doctrine is used to ban the Communist Party in the 1950s, a Nazi-like party in the 1950s as well, and it's used up to this day to justify aggressive state investigation and repression, the breaking apart of right-wing networks. Germany is a liberal democracy, but it has this tradition of constraining anti-system actors at this extreme level. So how does this fit in the US? Well, certainly I think repression and the breaking apart of right-wing networks, violent networks, is actually something that the Biden Justice Department will likely undertake. But the US Constitution neither mentions political parties nor allows for the banning of political parties. And so in this sense, the US is in a different situation than Germany. You know, one could, however, I think, imagine some sort of legislative effort of drawing the boundaries of acceptable behavior and saying if you pass beyond that boundary, this doesn't work. You know, the constitutionality of this in the United States is obviously a different question. And in Germany itself, this doctrine has come under quite a bit of attack. And the banning of parties is such a powerful weapon, in fact, that it's rarely used. And so in some sense, you know, this doctrine is important to keep in mind, but in the US context, it's hard to imagine how this would operate. Now, there's a distinctly American tradition for dealing, I think, with anti-system parties and dealing with extremists, and it's been presumed to work. And it comes out of the liberal tradition, I would say, of John Stuart Mill and Madison. So facing illiberalism, Mill might say, let all opinions compete. Let's have what Mill called a collision of adverse opinions, a kind of free marketplace of ideas, because it's only in this way that truth can be pursued. So competition is the great elixir in this model. Competition moderates. Especially political science in the 20th century teaches us that in a two-party system, above all, if you go wildly off course, you'll be punished at the ballot box. Electoral competition is a natural corrective for political extremism. There are parties that stray too far from the average voter are going to lose votes. This will compel them to moderate and broaden their appeal to win again. So like a football team, you lose, you fire the manager, you come up with a new program, new players, you regroup. Indeed, if you ask moderate Republicans today, or never Trump Republicans, what will get Republicans back on course, the answer is always a devastating electoral loss. And I think that's actually right. I mean, there is wisdom in this approach. However, the current approach seems not to quite be working. Losing is leading to radicalization, or at least at the very least, American Republican Party is not de-radicalizing. Just in the last 48 hours, one very conservative but widely regarded as a reasonable Republican member of the US Senate, Ohio Senator Rob Portman, has announced his retirement. And the story is that he may be replaced by Jim Jordan, the Ohio congressman, the ultimate Trump loyalist and fringe member of the Republican Congress. So the point is, as nice as the theory is, there seems to be a hitch to it. And I think what's the hitch is that there's two unrelated developments that have collided in our current moment to hinder the operation of the electoral marketplace, to deal with anti-system parties. The first is a development in electoral geography. Slow-moving demographic change and a long-run realignment of political parties after the enfranchisement of African Americans in 1965 have meant that while in the past cities had a mix of Republican Democratic voters, cities are more uniformly Democratic today than ever before, and rural areas of the country, which in the past were also divided between Republicans and Democrats, are becoming ever more Republican. So Democrats have become, in effect, the party of densely populated areas, and Republicans the party of sparsely populated areas. The correlation between population density and vote share for Democrats is higher today than at any point since 1900. So this is one development. This development, though, has crashed into a second factor, our Constitution, which hasn't changed. Our Constitution has long favored rural areas. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated areas, as we all know. The Senate, which with 2 representatives from every state, no matter the size, is also biased towards sparsely populated areas. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees from the president, the Supreme Court is also biased towards sparsely populated areas. So now for the first 200 years of our history, this bias had little partisan effect because there were urban and rural wings to both parties. Today, with the correlation, though, between party and population density, this means that Republicans have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Our constitutional system is systematically biased in favor of Republicans. You think about this, that Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only one time in 2004 since 1988, in over 30 years. Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only one time in this century, but in 2004, the popular vote, but they've governed for 12 of those 20 years. Trump's 2016 and Biden's 2020 Electoral College vote margins were identical, whereas Trump didn't even need to win the popular vote to get that margin, and Biden needed to win it by 5 million votes to get the same margin. In the Senate, we see a similar story. Democrats are overwhelmingly win the popular vote for the Senate 2016, 2018, and yet Republicans still controlled the Senate up until this year. Democrats routinely win more votes by getting a lot of votes in places like New York, California, but only getting 2 Senate seats, while Republicans continue to govern the Senate. In 2017, Neil Gorsuch became the first Supreme Court justice in American history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the population. This happened again with Brett Kavanaugh, and this past fall it happened a third time, so 3 times in 3 years. We have a counter-majoritarian system that's now systematically tilted in favor of Republicans. They can govern without winning. Now, the Republicans obviously didn't create this system, but they use it to entrench themselves in power. Now, all of this matters, and the reason I bring all of this up is because Republicans have become beneficiaries of what Steve and I, slightly tongue-in-cheek, think of as constitutional welfare, a set of institutions that dull the incentive to compete. If you can regularly win the most important offices in the land without seeking out more diverse voters, why do it? Especially if your base is telling you to radicalize in the way that Steve laid out. So Republicans are increasingly in this tight grip of a self-reinforcing spiral, being pushed by their non-urban conservative white base to radicalize, and our institutions provide no counterweight, no incentive to adapt. So again, if Republicans can win office without reaching out to urban diverse voters, why do it? And if they don't do it, there's little reason to moderate. So what increasingly what amounts to a kind of system of minority rule, this gives Republicans a head start in the Democratic game and shelters them from what we can think of as the kind of cold winds of competition. You know, in the economic realm, we know that protectionism can distort firm behavior. In the political realm, constitutional protectionism can distort party behavior. And I think this is part of what we're living with today. Tocqueville famously was worried about the tyranny of the majority in the United States. I think today we're seeing a bigger threat. It's not tyranny of the majority, but the opposite, a minority rule. A political system that routinely allows a minority party to control the most powerful offices in the country cannot remain legitimate for long. Now, certainly democracy is more than just minority rule, but without majority rule, there is no democracy. Now, some people may say, well, these counter-majoritarian checks are an important part of democracy, liberal democracy, and I think Steve and I both fully agree with this. The Bill of Rights is absolutely important. Judicial rule is absolutely important to help ensure individual liberties and that minority rights are protected. But disenfranchisement is not a feature of modern democracy. No other established democracy has an electoral college or makes regular use of the filibuster. So my final minutes, what I want to do then is sort of propose a set of ideas about moving forward, because in a system in which the majority doesn't govern, this is a problem because it both incentivizes, I think, bad behavior on the part of Republicans and in itself is not democratic. So in order for the kind of Madisonian Millian solution to kick in, to moderate anti-system party within our constitutional system, I think it's absolutely important to democratize our democracy. And so this agenda, which is increasingly kind of in circulation, I think in the last several months, sort of has three main parts. And I want to kind of lay them out very quickly, going from easiest to hardest. First, what needs to happen is needs to be, above all, defense and expansion of the right to vote. And actually some bills already passed the House of Representatives, 2019 House Resolution 1, which establishes nationwide automatic and same-day voter registration, expands early and absentee voting, prohibits flawed purges that remove eligible voters from the roll, requires independent redistricting commissions to draw congressional maps. A second bill passed the House in 2019, House Resolution 4, which would restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was gutted, of course, by the Supreme Court 2013. The current Senate, since the last several days, is taking up these items as part of their legislative agenda. So protect voting rights, that's the first leg. The second leg is institutional reforms that empower the majority. And this is now in the headlines every day, including things such as eliminating the Senate filibuster. The Senate filibuster has become a tool to protect minorities to such a degree that it makes our system dysfunctional, and it's been abused in ways that the system was never designed for. Now, this doesn't, of course, require constitutional change or even legislative change, but simply a change in the Senate rules. And we see kind of activity around this today. A similar kind of idea is to expand, grant statehood to Washington, D.C. or Puerto Rico, which would expand the US Senate. This doesn't require a constitutional amendment. The third pillar, though, of reform, perhaps the steepest hill to climb, is the elimination of the Electoral College itself, because, of course, this does require constitutional change. The House last voted for this, as our colleague Alex Keesar lays out in his wonderful book on the subject, in 1969, but it died in the Senate at the hands of old segregationist interests. This reform, though, is as difficult as it may be, is absolutely critical, as we've seen in the election results since November and the entire dispute over the electors. This is a system that's entirely dysfunctional and actually favors minorities over majorities. Now, critics might say that this agenda that I've just laid out is radical or unrealistic. But first of all, I want to say that reforming our democracies is as American as apple pie. When you go back to the early progressive era in the early 20th century, massive era of dislocation and economic change, and there was a sweeping reform movement at the beginning of the 20th century that remade our democracy. Key reforms that included things such as the introduction of party primaries, the expansion of citizen referenda, constitutional amendments allowing the national income tax, establishing the direct election of US senators, extending the suffrage to women. American democracy thrived in the 20th century because we reformed it. And I think it's absolutely necessary to do it again today. Second point is to say that it's unrealistic to carry out these reforms. That it may be difficult, that's right. But I think what's even more unrealistic is to think that we can just wag our finger at Republicans and say, oh, this is so bad the way you're behaving, and expect something to change. What needs to change is our rules, to change the incentives facing politicians, because in order to save our democracy, I think the Republican Party itself needs to change. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, the two of you. This was just a wonderful opening to this conversation. I was going to ask a question and ask you to respond, but I won't do this because the next speaker has to leave at 1. I'll simply say one quick remark. I think a lot of your presentation is very pessimistic. And of course, pessimism as an appeal. The big question is, how do we get the Republicans to join forces in changing the institutions along the line that you suggested? And taking a more sociological approach, I would say there's tensions within the Republican Party and within the Republican elite. O'Connell is now taking positions that are not popular with the Trumpians often. And you also have the Latinx vote, and you have the Asian votes, and you have the Gen Zs. There's a number of Gen Zs who are conservative and Republican who will also want their party to move in different ways. So we can also ask questions about a source of cultural change within the Republican Party. I'm just going to say this, and some things that we can return to after Sheri's presentation. So Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Michèle. And that was just so fascinating to listen to. I have so many things I could add as well. So unfortunately, I will say that if it's pessimism you want to get away from, I'm probably not going to take us there. So I think we can hopefully that lean on Sheri maybe to offer some more optimism after this. But I will talk just a little bit about the far right fringe and what's been happening in the US and globally, and maybe a little bit about what we can expect from the Biden administration, if I can get to that. So the first thing I want to say is that what we've been seeing in the far right fringe over the past decade plus really starts after Obama was elected. That's when the initial surge in hate groups and then militia, anti-government militia growth starts to happen. So we see first an explosion of hate groups. They reached a peak around 2009, 2010, 11, in the wake of the first election of an African-American president, and then subsequently a kind of mainstreaming and normalization that people are more familiar with from over the past few years, partly through campaign rhetoric and partly through deliberate attempts to organize across the far right, not just in the US, but globally. So in the 5 years prior to 2000, the UN documented a 320% increase in right-wing terror globally. So this is not something that started with one administration, nor can we expect it to end with one administration. But the mainstreaming and normalization of some of the rhetoric, the perceived legitimation that mainstreaming and normalization gave to a lot of these groups and individuals definitely added some fuel to the fire. And we see things like in the stand back, stand by language in that first debate this past fall around the Proud Boys, whether that was intentional or not, there was an immediate explosion online across the far right fringe who felt legitimized and felt called to action by those remarks. I will say that 2017 was probably a first real wake-up call for the American public when the Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville. And it's important to remember that that was called Unite the Right for a reason, because the extreme far right has been tremendously fragmented, characterized by a lot of infighting over the years, and hasn't been able to form coalitions. And that was an attempt, which failed. So they failed miserably. They ended up just as fragmented afterward as they had been. They tried to have a Unite the Right 2 rally a year later. Hardly anybody showed up, and they remained completely fragmented, characterized by infighting and plagued by lawsuits, which did help kind of undermine some of their power. But by the time January 6th rolled around, what we saw was a coalition form, even if it was spontaneous and loose. There was a toxic mix of groups and individuals there from across the neo-Nazi and white supremacist fringe, a wide range of militia, Proud Boy types, patriot militias, and then of course QAnon, and then the radicalized, mobilized pro-Trump and conservative supporters who showed up on that day, and more spontaneous action to violence. You can kind of see that in the difference between the planned individuals who were there with tactical gear, with flexi-cuffs, with radios, with plans to enact violence, and those who were weaponizing spontaneously flagpoles and fire extinguishers. So there were two really distinct approaches there that kind of came together. And what we saw there, as well as what we had seen in August in Germany with a similar attempt to storm the parliament there, the Reichstag, that failed, but made it past the first police cordon. So they were thwarted just after they made it past the first wave of police, several hundred rioters. In both cases, you had a kind of committed group of militant extremists who used the backdrop of a spontaneous mob to enact potentially what could have been much worse violence. And so I think thinking about those two things together and whether that August attempt in many ways was a lesson learned, was an earlier attempt by the global far right, if you will, and that this wasn't just kind of coincidental, that we've seen this escalating attempts on state capitals. We have seen the assassination of a German politician last year, the attempt to kidnap the Michigan governor and the Virginia governor, the assassination of Joe Cox. So in addition to the terrorist white supremacist extremist acts that we've seen over the past few years in Pittsburgh and El Paso and Christchurch and elsewhere, we have seen this steady escalation of the anti-government extremist fringe as well, I think, but in ways that haven't been connected or understood in the same global context as increasingly the white supremacist extremist part of the far right fringe has begun to be understood. So I think that's just an important sort of point to understand in terms of this kind of strategic and planned violence, taking advantage of a backdrop of mobilized, more spontaneous mob and trying to attack a tyrannical government. That's the goal, sort of undermine this tyrannical government. So in many ways, January 6th was the kind of uniting of the right that had failed earlier. It was a moment where the right came together and was able to use each other across that spectrum that normally does not cooperate to achieve a goal that they continue to celebrate right now as a tremendous success, even though the violence that they had, some of them had planned, didn't ultimately get enacted. They made it all the way into the Capitol. They're celebrating it and continue to celebrate it globally. What stitches those coalitions together across that spectrum is a commitment to some combination of four things. So you have the anti-democratic beliefs that includes things like refusal to protect minority rights, but also no belief in the freedom of the press or rule of law, authoritarianism. Then we have hierarchical beliefs and superiority and inferiority across groups. Those could be male supremacists, Christian supremacists, white supremacists. We have fantasies and conspiracy theories, mostly around an idea of restoration. And then we have sort of prior utopia, return to some kind of better time and utopian time. And then we have the use of violence and the willingness, or sometimes even the compulsion to use violence, the belief that violence is not just an acceptable solution, but the desirable one, that the goal is to bring down systems. And that's the kind of what's called the accelerationist fringe, the desire to bring chaos about. And there were accelerationist elements to January 6th as well. In terms of vulnerability among the population, one of the things I want to say is that there's a lot of talk, and Stephen mentioned it, I think, very clearly, this idea that people feel like they're losing something. And sometimes that gets mislabeled as disenfranchisement, which didn't happen here today, but often in the media you hear. I think it's really important to distinguish between the sense of precarity, which we do know from research is a predictor of participation in the far right, and actual disenfranchisement. So what we're seeing is not people who by and large are unemployed or the lowest income levels, but people who feel like that something could be taken away from them. And it's coupled with entitlement. So it's something could be taken away from them to which they feel entitled and given to someone else who doesn't deserve it. So that's a really important kind of combination of emotional cues that creates vulnerability to whether it's white supremacist extremists who feel like there's a conspiracy to have white genocide happen, they call it, and through demographic change and immigration, take away a white majority or a white country, or whether that's people fighting for Second Amendment rights, which are going to be taken away, or if it's a stop the steal, right? That the election has been stolen and it's going to be taken away illegitimately and given to people who don't deserve it. So it's this precarity coupled with entitlement that creates tremendous vulnerability to a lot of this rhetoric that's out there, propaganda that's circulating. And I will say that right now, I run a research lab, so I have a team of about a dozen students and scholars who spend a lot of time monitoring this stuff online. And what we are seeing online is a lot of recruitment happening, attempts to recruit from the white supremacist and further extreme fringe of conservative and pro-Trump voters who they believe are disillusioned and will be able to be more vulnerable to recruitment. So they have playbooks circulating, they have strategies and scripts circulating. They call them Parler refugees in reference to the app that Parler that was shut down in the wake of the election for being a source of the disinformation. And then they're pulling them over into more anonymizing apps or with encrypted private spaces potentially, and trying to recruit them. So I think it's really important to understand, even if ultimately they fail, that there is an attempt and that there are attempts going on to broaden the base of the extreme fringe by pulling people from out of the mainstream. The last thing I'll say is just in terms of what to expect from the Biden administration, and what I hope we can expect, but I'm not sure yet, is that I think so far what we're seeing in the immediate response is an approach that is very much focused on securitization, on seeing this as a law enforcement problem, and as a counterterrorism, counter-extremism problem, which of course matters, and there is accountability, and it's important to get the resources to the right places. But the argument I would make is that we aren't going to begin to address this. We don't also see it as a problem of education, of combating misinformation and disinformation, of helping people understand what persuasive extremist rhetoric looks like, how propaganda affects individuals, why techniques like scapegoating are so prominent. And that's basic media literacy, right? Which we need for fifth graders and we need for 50-year-olds, as well as other kinds of interventions that I can talk about. And I think when you look at what other countries have done, Norway, in the wake of the terrible terrorist attack in Oslo, creates the largest and most well-respected research center on extremism. Actually, it's not just, it was originally right-wing extremism, but now is broadly about extremism. Germany, 3 months after that attempt on the parliament, already in the works, obviously long before that August attack, but in December of 2020, announced a 1 billion euro investment over the next 3 years in 89 specific measures to address rising right-wing extremism. That includes resources for law enforcement, but also better monitoring and reporting of law enforcement and their own complicity, military intelligence and security services as well, in terms of whether they're engaged in the far right, and more education initiative, more funding for research, more funding for NGOs. So, and then there's another 150 million euro coming in the next budget cycle as well. So we also see there's Christchurch, the report that just came out in December as well, that recommends more community-based approaches. So we have models to look at in this country, and the model doesn't have to only be the response to 9/11 with all of its flaws, which of course did create the Department of Homeland Security. We have massive amounts of investments that have been made for security purposes. And I think there was a missed opportunity in the past to think about this in a broader scope. And I would just say, I hope that that there's a moment now where we can be thinking about this in broader terms, that it includes agencies like Health and Human Services and mental health and education, as well as justice and homeland security. So I will stop there. I know I talked really quickly, but I want to make sure that there's time for Michèle to ask a question of any of us before I have to jump off, unfortunately, for a prior commitment.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you so much, Cynthia. This was just terrific. And I particularly like the end of the talk where you remind us of everything that Germany is doing and Norway to fight the far right. And we know that after World War II in Germany, there was the institutionalization of a very extensive program of civic education in the school. In the American context, where you don't have a strong national union of teachers the way you have in Germany, and where education is way more decentralized, including in terms of funding of education, how can you imagine that the democratic leadership can find leverages to try to maybe connect nationalism and enroll Republicans in this joint program of defending democracy, which most nationalists may want to embrace as well?
Right. I mean, I think one of the things I'm really concerned about in the wake of the pandemic is there's already, when you're talking about actual formal education, we're already hearing so much language about catching up, right? Kids needing to catch up. They should go summer, maybe they held back a year, whatever. That my concern is that even after the pandemic, we'll go back in the formal education system. Anything that it's already done to incorporate civic education in the arts or anything like that is going to be put to the side in order to get kids' scores back up. And so I think anything that anybody can do constantly to remind local education systems and districts of the importance of the whole education of the child and not just the math and science scores and English scores that have to be brought back to make up for the lost time, I think is really important. So I don't have a lot of faith right now, though, in the formal education system, absent new standards that maybe the Department of Education could make as a recommendation. I think that really this has to be a coalition of civil society organizations and partnerships with NGOs that are doing this already quite well. There are groups like Life After Hate, people who are working with the extremist fringe, trying to de-radicalize, disengage, interrupt radicalization pathways with research and evidence. And I think that having a broader range of funding initiatives and thinking about education as happening not only in the classroom, but in very much like that German approach, they have a federal agency for civic education that includes every imaginable, conceivable way of educating the public about public things that are in their interest as a society, as a way of strengthening democracy and not just combating extremism. So then it becomes, an obligation of everyone instead of just the specialized few's responsibility. And so I think, that maybe sounds a little bit overly optimistic, but I think that if we can start to see this as a crisis of democracy and not just as a growth of the extremist fringe and see it that way, we have a better chance.
Yeah, well, it seems a lot of the tug of war that you're describing is about maintaining people within mainstream politics and preventing this invasion of the far right. So who are the allies in the Republican Party that could be counted on?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think it's really, really important to look for not just individuals at the national level, but at the local level within the Republican Party, ordinary Republican voters to sort of not feel shamed and excluded from this process, but included and to really help people understand what the boundaries are of democracy. Where does democracy end? I mean, we've just been hearing this, right? Where do democratic sets of beliefs and practices end and something different begin? And how do people in the center, help ward off the fringe? And what are these attempts to manipulate and recruit them doing? And I really think understanding it as manipulation is part of that. So on college campuses, that means working with young Republican clubs and trying to help them understand that in the past, they have been used by outside groups who manipulated them to bring provocative speakers to campus through invitations that were really not in their own interest, but really helped the press and the media attention to those provocative speakers and their own goals, but that weren't really in their interest under the rubric of free speech. So how are they being manipulated by outside groups? How are these persuasive scripts circulating that are trying to actually do outreach to them? And I think helping people understand what manipulation looks like and why there are bad actors that might be trying to do something that's not in your own interest, I think is really important.
Well, this is fascinating, Cynthia. So thank you so much. And I'll invite—
Thank you so much.
There are many people who have questions for you. So I'll invite them to put them on the Q&A and we'll forward them to you so you can engage with them directly if you want.
Sounds good. I'm so sorry that I can't stay longer. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. And now we're turning to Sheri Berman. Sheri.
Okay, great, thank you. It's hard to follow three such wonderful speakers with such provocative presentations. Rather than try to sort of improve upon, which I surely could not, the presentations of my colleagues, I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the crisis of American democracy has to teach us, perhaps, about democratic success and failure more generally. More specifically, perhaps, what have Americanists, that is to say, people who study American politics, comparativists, other social scientists, what have we done a good job explaining, and what remains to be done? What are some of the areas that we should look at a little bit more in depth as a result of having experienced this crisis of American democracy? So the first thing that has struck me as a comparativist living through the last 4 years is how much has been lost by not having folks who study American politics more fully integrated into comparative social science. It's really only with the kind of immediate crisis that Trump has represented, or Trump represented over the past years, that students of American politics really turned en masse to examining the country's democratic experience and comparative perspective. And I think it's very telling in this regard, as Michèle pointed out, that the most influential book touching on the American experience, which was written by two of our panelists here, Dan and Steve, was not written by an Americanist, but in fact was written by two comparativists, right? That Americanists really have not, or did not think enough about what it takes to make democracy work in general, and what the supports for stability and the causes of instability might have been in American politics. And they've really only, accordingly, over the past years, in great numbers, zeroed in on some of these sources of stability and instability that my comparativist colleagues have focused on for forever, right? So the most obvious, and one that Dan and Steve touched upon, is the dangers of centrifugal as opposed to centripetal party systems, polarized versus non-polarized party systems, the dangers of ideological sectarian parties as opposed to pragmatic catch-all parties. This was a significant part of the research that was done on post-war Europe, for example. These kinds of changes were seen as critical differences between the interwar and post-war period. And, this seems like the kind of thing that should have been incorporated into research on American politics much sooner. The other thing, given that, that struck me, given that we have two sociologists here, Michèle and Cynthia, who unfortunately had to leave, was the broad interrelationship between the social, economic, and political spheres, right? Great political sociologists, Barrington Moore, Seymour Martin Lipset, you name it, had long looked at the ways in which different social and economic factors and variables influence the stability or instability of democracy, inequality, changes or the nature of the social structure, rural versus urban cleavages, religious versus secular divides. These are long things that comparative students of democracy focused on when trying to understand democratic success or failure, but were not fully incorporated, I think, into American analyses of our democratic political system. And the fact, again, that I think Americanists were not more fully integrated into comparative social science means not only that some of these trends that we're now focusing on were not fully analyzed, they weren't actually even, I think, recognized as the dangers to democracy we now so clearly see them as being. Okay, so a second implication of the American case. We need to do a much better job of integrating the study of long and short-term causes of democratic decay and decline, right? So, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, I sort of Googled things like, saving American democracy, right? And not surprisingly, the journalists who write on this, and this is their job, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation, look at very short-term causes. Who saved American democracy? Black voters saved American democracy. Women saved American democracy. The actions of impartial electoral officials, that kind of thing, right? But there's a more general emphasis, I would say, in the American focused literature on short-term factors. That is to say, trying to explain the problems in American democracy by looking at the actions of key political actors. Trump, the Republican Party, which we've heard a lot about, white nationalists and supremacists and extremists like Cynthia discussed, how these kinds of political actors have undermined the norms and institutions of democracy. Now, this is obviously very important. I'm not trying to say this is not something we should be studying, but I think it's important to step back from these immediate causes and recognize that things like extremism, radicals, they are symptoms more than they are causes. That is to say that extremism and radicalism grows, right, or rather becomes powerful only once democratic elites and institutions have already begun to fail. So let me illustrate this with some sort of anecdotes, right? Hitler, for example, did not destroy German democracy, right? His party only became popular and he was only able to come to power after Weimar had already more or less imploded. This is the difference between the 1923 beer hall putsch and his coming to power in 1932, 1933, right? He was only able to come to power. The Nazis were only able to succeed after democratic parties and politicians had proven unable to deal with the problems that Germany faced, right? Same thing. Mussolini's fascist party gets almost no votes after the First World War. He's only able to come to power several years later after Italian democracy had literally imploded, right? If Hitler or Mussolini had been born in a country where democratic politicians did a better job of dealing with interwar problems, the United States, Sweden, both of them and the parties they represented would have remained historical footnotes, right? The same is true with Trump, of course. Had Trump decided to run in the 1990s, I doubt he would have won. And even if he had somehow won, I doubt he would have had the impact that he had after winning in 2016. And I also doubt, going back to Dan and Steve's presentation, that the Republican Party would have radicalized to the same degree that it did after 2016, right? Another way of thinking about this kind of dynamic is with reference, of course, to one of my favorite quotes by Karl Marx in his 18th Brumaire, and that is that individuals and more generally political actors don't make history on their own, they make it in the circumstances that are given to them. So a lesson, an implication, right? We need to better integrate a study of the decisions and actions, behavior of key political actors with the circumstances that make it possible for them to undermine democracy. What they want to do is not enough, right? They have to be in the right circumstances for that kind of thing to matter. And here's again another place where comparative and American work could learn from each other. Comparativists have long focused on long-term causes of democratic success and failure, and Americanists, as I've said, have focused much more on the short term. So when you look, for instance, again, back at the American literature, and this was mentioned a little bit by Dan and Steve in their presentations, right? There's a lot of emphasis in sort of thinking about big picture questions about social and cultural grievances, right? So if you look at American studies of voting behavior, for instance, why do people support Trump? Why do they vote for this Republican Party, right? The argument here, primarily, the dominant argument is about social and cultural grievances, right? Now, there's no doubt that social and cultural grievances are motivating a large number of Republican elites and probably a large number of Republican voters. But this has to be the beginning of an explanation, not its end, right? Not only because from a historical perspective, we know that things like racism and xenophobia have not actually been increasing over the past years, right? But Trump was elected in 2016, not a high point of social and cultural grievances or racial resentment. Similarly, the Republicans have gotten more radical over time, but this has not coincided with a radicalization of American attitudes about race and immigration. Actually, in fact, and I'd love to hear what Steve and Dan thought about this, the biggest attitudinal shift that has in fact happened over the past decades is among the people like us. That is to say, white, highly educated progressives. Our attitudes are the ones that have shifted most over the past 10 years, not the attitudes of the average Republican voter or of Americans more generally, right? So the Republican Party is radicalized, but the radicalization in the sense of moving the most attitudinally is not actually Republican voters at all. It's a small but important segment of the Democratic electorate whose attitudes have shifted the most over this same period. Similarly, and this goes back to something Cynthia brought up, these trends that we're talking about with the Republican Party and Trump, right? We've seen analogous trends in other countries. The rise of right-wing populism across Europe, in other places, Brazil and elsewhere. But these countries don't have America's history of slavery, of having to fight for the civil rights movement, having to fight for civil rights in the 1960s, the shifts that happened, as Dan and Steve pointed out as a result of that. These are distinctively American phenomena, and yet we have seen similar political parties and similar extremist movements in other countries without America's distinctive history. Again, not to say that racial and grievances don't matter, not to say that backlash against the civil rights movement is unimportant, but if we see cross-national phenomena that are similar, we have to be able to go beyond those idiosyncratic explanations and think about what some of the broader or cross-national trends are. Okay, so I think, again, going back to this long versus short term, in addition to looking at attitudes, right, motivations and preferences, we need to think more carefully about why some of these attitudes or preferences become politically salient or powerful at some times and in some places and not others. Okay, so we need to dig deeper into those kinds of questions about political salience and political prioritization. We need to think about what kinds of circumstances trigger the in and out group sentiments that so many people think are important in explaining, again, voting for Trump, radicalization of the Republican Party, blah, 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 blah. What kinds of circumstances, again, to get back to that sort of Marx quote, what kinds of circumstances deepen the cleavages in American society, right? What kinds of circumstances have facilitated or promoted the kind of zero-sum or apocalyptic version of politics that is so prevalent in the United States today? Okay, so another final implication of the American case that I thought might be worth raising is the need for more research on how to bring countries back from the precipice. So we have a great literature in comparative politics on how democracies die. Again, stealing from Dan and Steve here, the title of their book, right? We know, or we've spent a lot of time thinking about how democracies die. We also have spent a lot of time thinking about how democracies can be rebuilt after a transition. That is to say, how do we construct democracy after an authoritarian or dictatorial regime fails? But this is a different question that the American case confronts us with, which is how do we arrest backsliding before it's too late, right? Not when democracies have died, but when they seem to have been weakened or have decayed to a significant degree, right? It's not the same as reconstructing after a collapse or an authoritarian interlude. And thinking about bringing countries back from the precipice, right, seems to me to involve thinking about at least two different things, right? One is fighting the extremists or the anti-democratic parties that are causing or promoting democratic decay or disintegration, right? But since, as I said, I think it is really best to think of extremists and radicals as symptoms and not causes of democratic decay or decline, we also need to think about how to revitalize or rebuild or strengthen democratic institutions and norms before they collapse, right? Okay, so let's go to that first one. How do we fight extremists, anti-democratic movements, blah, 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 right? So Cynthia talked a little bit about this in her presentation, right? So I won't go over some of the things that she talked about, you know, vis-a-vis fighting extremist movements, things like that, right? One thing I think we could and should think a little bit more about is opposition strategies, right? When you're faced with an anti-democratic party or a party with anti-democratic leanings, like the Republican Party that Dan and Steve described, what should the opposition do, right? Democracy has not died. Democratic processes and institutions still exist, but you're facing an extreme, potentially anti-democratic opponent. What do you do, right? What is the correct strategy for the opposition in that kind of situation? We need to think more about this, right? Now, the one only lesson that I could think of that jumped out from the historical and comparative experience for me, right, is the importance of unity, right? It is extremely difficult to beat back challenges to democracy if the opposition is divided. The problem, of course, is that extremists are provocative and they tend to provoke extremism in response, right? And we saw some of this kind of division or debate within the Democratic Alliance, right? Do we respond to Republican intransigence? Do we respond to Republican illiberalism by undertaking the same hardball tactics that they have now that we're in power, right? Seems to me that the historical literature suggests that as long as democratic institutions and procedures are still in place, that this is not the right strategy. That if you are not unified, if all democratic forces, small d, democratic forces, do not remain on the same page, but rather fight with each other, that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to fight back threats from democracy. A related sort of lesson that some people have drawn from contemporary cases like local elections in Istanbul and Budapest. Obviously, these are places where democratic decay has gone much further than the United States. Again, is that you win elections against extremists, right-wing populists, whatever, not by playing their game, but by preaching unity and by trying, if not to win over some of your opponents, at least to avoid mobilizing them. That is to say, giving them an excuse to go on the offensive. But more research needs to be done on this. That is to say, how to counter anti-democratic parties or movements, I think, over the short term. Now, over the long term, again, strengthening democracy. How can we revitalize democracy so that it is less susceptible to threats from extremists or anti-democratic actors? Here, it seems to me that we need to figure out how to deal with the underlying dissatisfaction and divisions, that is to say, the circumstances that enable populists and authoritarians to thrive. Now, here's one thing, again, that jumps out at me from the comparative politics literature, right? We know from the comparative politics research that tribalized, divided societies are fragile. They are prone to conflict, and they have difficulty sustaining democracy. And so what does that mean? That means that in cases like the United States, right, where we're trying to walk back from the precipice, right, we need to figure out ways to limit or diminish divisions in our society, or to, again, use the terminology that was used by my colleagues previously, how do we limit or diminish the in and out group thinking that's so prevalent in American politics today? How do we create or recreate the sense of national unity and social solidarity that is absolutely necessary to ensure things like toleration, compromise, yada, yada, yada? These are the things that are necessary to make democracy work. You cannot have that in a divided society like the one that we have today. Now, there's some, again, things in the literature that we might look back at to help us think about how to overcome the divisions that plague American society and democracy today. There's a lot of evidence that impartial states are better than partial ones. That is to say, states, governments that treat citizens as equals are much more likely to help overcome societal divisions than ones that are partial in their policies and dealings with different social groups. Discourses that emphasize what citizens share and have in common rather than what differentiates or divides them. Lots of work, for instance, on things like inclusive nationalism versus exclusive nationalism might be relevant here. Another obvious finding in the comparative politics literature is the need for cross-cutting versus reinforcing cleavages, right? You want to encourage in society networks, memberships, affiliations that break down silos and boundaries rather than encouraging people to stick in their own lane, to borrow a phrase that is common in a related sphere. So I will stop there and thank Michèle again for inviting me and for my colleagues for their provocative presentations.
This was terrific. Thank you, Sheri. You brought in a whole other dimension that has to do with the research agenda, the way in which we can draw on the past of our disciplines to ask the questions we need to ask to better understand the current moment. I was so happy that you mentioned Lipset and Barrington Moore as a sociologist, a hero that I share with Steve Levitsky and probably Dan as well. And the questions they asked about cross-cutting cleavages and the ways in which status factors in political choices. And I think that's where we really need to broaden the agenda of the social sciences. I know that in political science right now, there's a new project led by Jacob Hacker, Paul Pearson, and Kathy Thielen to develop American political economy, really drawing on the tradition of comparative political economy to precisely connect inequality with institutions. So I think there's a lot of potential, and moving in the other direction, as you know, Sheri, there's a huge literature to which in which I'm involved on how boundaries are changed in sociology. It's a booming field that has really produced an enormous amount of work over the last decades. And I think the bridge between our literature and political science has yet to happen. And there's a lot to learn there. For instance, Rob Willer, who's a social psychologist at Stanford, is doing an experiment about what kind of words should be used to create bridges between people who are located in different parts of the polarization. And, you know, fights over who owns the family, who owns America. These are, you know, you can lower the salience of boundaries by using over terms like these that can be shared by many, by promoting more of a pluralistic approach, by multiplying the criteria through which the worth and the deservingness of people is assessed. So that's where the session we're going to have in 2 weeks with Michael Sandel kicks in, you know, the ways in which meritocracy, the kind of achievements that all of us in the call share, is really perceived as a major insult by the 62% of the population that is not college educated. So we need to ask ourselves in a very serious way, the way in which the taken for grantedness, the terms in which we think about the political community is deeply exclusive for so many people. So you had a question for Steve and Dan that I would like to come back to before I open the Q&A, Sheri. And I think your question had to do with what they think of the fact that the growing polarization is found among progressive people like us, I presume. We know of the radicalization. You said the radicalization is not happening at the right. In fact, it's happening at the among people like us.
The most notable attitudinal change, perhaps, over
because it ain't radicalization.
Well, I wouldn't. Yeah. I don't know why I want to call it radicalization, but the if not the most significant, one of the most significant attitudinal shifts has been on the part of, again, like the people who are on this panel or perhaps in this seminar more generally, right? And that it's not that clearly, while we have Trump and the Republicans playing on these racial and cultural grievances, it's not as if there's been this dramatic shift towards more racist or xenophobic attitudes, you know, over whatever it is the past decade or so.
But there has been a dramatic shift that you're missing, Sheri. And that is the overall number of Americans who are racially conservative has not changed dramatically, but there's been a partisan sorting through which higher educated maybe Reagan Republicans in the 1980s have migrated toward the Democratic Party, and usually non-college educated whites who had been Democrats are migrating to the Republican Party. So call them racial conservatives, call them populist voters, call them authoritarian personalities. That overall sector of the population hasn't changed dramatically, but they've migrated. In the 1970s, they were evenly distributed between the two parties. Over the last couple of decades, they've become concentrated in the Republican Party. You combine that with primary elections, and you allow essentially the extreme right to win control of a major political party.
I thought you were referring, Sheri, to the fact that racial attitudes have become much more liberal overall. I mean, that despite our politics, if you look at the level of mass opinion, racial, and in fact, the failure of Trump's replay of the silent majority strategy this election, he tried to replay 1968 and thought if he stirred up, racial turmoil in cities, that this would rebound to his benefit. That didn't happen. And I think that partly reflects the growing liberalization of attitudes. And that's actually exactly, I think that's maybe your point, is that, this is the great paradox of the period in which we live, that exactly at the moment that attitudes, so, what's wrong, I think why that's important to highlight though, and what I take from that point, Sheri, is that, and maybe this is, I guess, your point as well, is that this paper by Yascha Mounk that got a lot of attention, this is just one example, not to pick on that particular paper, but the mass attitudes away from, he was sort of saying that there was a mass turn away from democracy at the level of mass attitudes, and I tend not to believe that. I think in general, in fact, the opposite is the case, that attitudes towards democracy at the mass level and race are quite liberal. And this, to my mind, brings us back to the point that even if majorities are racially inclusive, if our electoral system and constitutional system is structured in such a way that those loud majorities don't actually speak in our politics, then their attitudes aren't fully reflected in our politics. But maybe I'm not sure if that was your point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we have 23 questions in the Q&A from a very wide range of people. So I'll just ask a few, and I'll start with one that is directly building on the conversation we're having now from Mayor Marks Ferry, who's a senior expert of gender in sociology. She asked, where does the strong division between the college educated and those who are not, 62% total of population is not, fits in? Why and how does gender identity figures in for both women and men, not sex alone, but all the kinds of masculinity and femininity deemed normative? How are they relevant to the political identity expressed in this partisanship? So is this a question that means anything to you? You don't want to talk about it? Well,
let me just say, I don't have a heck of a lot to say on the gender issue, okay. But getting back to a point that Sheri made, and I think correctly, it's a problem for a democratic society if parties are lined up on educated versus non-educated lines. It is a recipe for populism if all of the college-educated folk are in one party and are dominating the political, economic, and cultural establishments. That is a recipe for populism and an underlying, and Sheri's right, that's an underlying problem that's not about to go away. And that's not,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I would just but I would caution though, I think that there's a kind of misconception, and not on your part, Steve, but I think somebody listening to you could misunderstand it to say that the Democratic Party is the party of educated elites and the Republican Party is the party of the working class. So that's often how it's portrayed in the media. And working class is a euphemism for white working class. There's plenty of non-college educated non-whites who also support the Democratic Party. So, I think it's this combination of class and race and gender, as per the question, that is particularly a potent combination.
Yeah,
it's a good point. That's why I bring Daniel along to these things.
And Biden has appointed Marty Walsh. I think there will be a strong presence of the labor movement in his cabinet. So it will be interesting to see how salient this is. Now, a different question from a political scientist, Ron Rogowski. By analogy to the German and other European restrictions on hate speech, do you see any realistic chance that our courts will modify the Brandenburg test, Brandenburg versus Ohio 1969, that only advocacy of imminent lawless action can be punished or banned? Retired Justice Souter has expressed some openness to this possibility.
So my impression from that is that Ron knows much more about the answer to that question than I do. So I don't want to answer it, except to say that, I mean, this is, I mean, it flows naturally from the discussion of militant democracy. I mean, I think that's why I'm nonetheless responding to it. The point I take away, and I put this in the chat, is that, I think there is an American broadly speaking, American self-conception that free speech, it's in the Constitution, it's always been there. But, for much of American history, the First Amendment was about federal regulation of free speech, and states could do whatever they wanted. The 14th Amendment changed that. But this only came in, and my understanding is this only came really into significance into the 20th century. So the point of this is that free speech, that free speech is more malleable, and the doctrine of free speech and what this means and how it's interpreted is much more malleable than our current collective sort of misunderstanding of it. And so what that suggests to me is not that I'm not an advocate of free speech, but just that in principle, there's more room for maneuver on this kind of thing. So the fact that, you can ban the advertising of cigarettes on television, but it's okay to threaten members of Congress, and that's protected free speech, seems a little odd, right? So I think we are in a situation, although our Supreme Court may not be in a position to do any, is politically, doesn't make a lot of sense. I think there's a growing sense that this is something, especially in the age of social media, is something that's going to be revisited.
Mm-hmm. There's a brilliant book on this by Eric Bleich, one of our fellow Europeanists, Freedom to Hate, which compares the approach to hate speech in France, in particular in the US, explaining that in the US, you can burn a cross on your lawn, and that's defended by free speech, at the same time as everyone knows very well the association between this burning cross and the KKK. So it's a book that I really recommend. It's just terrific. Now, another question by Hisham Alawi, who is part of the Weatherhead Center. He asked, I would like either of you, well, at the time he wrote, it was, I believe, Steve speaking. Now you're just a single person, Dan and Steve. I would like either of you to say something about the role of social media. The latter seems to empower individuals, but at the same time encourage polarization. Secondly, money is having an unhealthy effect on US politics. It takes the shift away from parties to personality. Can you please comment on this?
Sure. So social media, we are really still quite recently, social scientists, politicians, states, learning about the consequences of social media. And the evidence that I've seen so far from research suggests that yes, in fact, exposure to social media does have a radicalizing and polarizing effect. That said, I wouldn't push that too far, in the sense that social media is not causing our polarization. It may exacerbate it, may make it more difficult to engage in in overcoming these things along the lines that Sheri was talking about. But it's not the underlying cause. We did not need Twitter to fall into polarization, civil war in the 1850s and 60s. The Spanish didn't need Facebook to go into civil war in the 1930s. The Chileans didn't need YouTube to collapse it in the extreme polarization in the 1970s. So I think the danger of focusing on social media, although we need to understand its effects, and I think we need to much more seriously regulate social media. The danger of focusing on that is I think it sometimes misses the underlying causes of polarization. I see it much more as an exacerbant.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to add anything? No. Sheri, I know that you have to leave at some point. Is it the time when you have to leave us, or you can?
Yeah,
stay?
in like a minute or so.
Okay. Okay, I'll ask.
Give her a huge question that she can only answer in 30
yeah.
seconds.
something you really cannot answer. Okay, here you are from Annette Idler. Considering the urban-rural divide in terms of voting pattern, do you think there has been an urban bias among scholars and beyond in trying to understand people and their behavior? Do we need more dialogue between rural and urban to bridge the divide? And if so, how would it work? And a related question, which I'll throw in, where has it gone? Anyway, the question is, are there any reasons why people who feel excluded, the reasons they feel excluded should be addressed, and which are they? You know, there's real resentment out there. A lot of the resentment is justified. What can we address and how? So Sheri, these are for you before you disappear.
So, I mean, those are obviously great questions. I mean, I think it's important again to note that, you know, this is a cleavage that has, as Dan and Steve pointed out, gotten deeper over the past, you know, whatever generation, but it's not a new one. I mean, center periphery cleavages were one of the key cleavages that Lipset and Rocan pointed out, right? And the center periphery cleavage was important for a number of reasons, not least of which was that the periphery was the part of the country that fell behind economically, right? The new industries were those that were concentrated in the center. And what has happened over the past decades, as we know from economic research, is that that distinction or differentiation has grown again. I mean, differences between the economic vitality of center and periphery have gone back to, you know, levels that we haven't seen in a very long time. The post-war years, again, being the sort of the exception rather than the rule. And as Dan and Steve have pointed out, right, it's these reinforcing cleavages that are so problematic, right, which is that you have in the United States, for instance, in the Republican Party, an overly large proportion of folks who are falling into these falling behind categories, right, economically, socially, the part of the country. And so this is, you know, this is really very problematic. And we've seen these kinds of cleavages pop up, not just in the United States. I mean, yellow vest protests were very much of a similar kind of, you know, mobilized around a similar kind of cleavage. And I think as a society, we need to think about inequalities, not just inequality, right? There's economic inequality. There's obviously the inequality that surrounds folks who have been members of historically underprivileged groups. But inequality is bad. It doesn't matter what type of inequality it is, because it tends to create grievances, it tends to create dissatisfaction, it triggers in and out group sentiment. And it is absolutely true that in the United States and other Western societies, this center periphery cleavage is not simply a figment of people's imagination. These areas have fallen behind, and the Republican Party, that is now the champion of those regions, has not done a very good job of addressing their actual needs. And so, yes, this is a crucial cleavage. Yes, these grievances are real. And yes, if we want to bring our democracy back from the precipice, we need to figure out how to address these kinds of cleavages along with other kinds of cleavages and inequalities. So
Great.
thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheri, for joining us. Okay, Dan and
just Steve and me. Gosh.
Yes, now it's all on you. So, so I know that we're just going to stop in 10 minutes. So it gives us.
Daniel and I we'll argue among ourselves to keep
Okay.
things interesting.
Exactly. This is a chance for you to fight it out. So a question from Sam Van Noort. Steve, you argued that parties choose to play dirty if, one, they feel that they will be electorally uncompetitive in the future, and two, they see their competitor party as an existential threat. But Prof. Ziblatt proposed solution is to reform US electoral institution to make one more likely for the Republican Party. Assuming that two won't change, how can we, at least in the short run, avoid further radicalization of the Republican Party?
It's a tough dilemma. Our bet is that at this point, the Republican Party is that there one possible response. I mean, I thank Sam for the question, and I think he's absolutely right to point to this tension. One possible response to a fearful, radicalized party is to create exactly what our founders created in the 18th century, a set of counter-majoritarian institutions that protect the fearful party, the radicalized party, so that it doesn't have to, it feels secure rather than facing an existential threat. The thing is that the Republican Party has essentially come to use these counter-majoritarian institutions as a crutch. And clearly, if you look at the behavior of the last decade, it has not been sufficient to sort of stem the fears of Republican activists and the Republican base. I'm not sure about the party leaders. So it's true. Moving in a more majoritarian direction would accentuate in the short term the fears of Republican, at least of Republican leaders. The thing is, there's just no evidence, no guarantee that sort of institutional protections will moderate them. If anything, it's pushing in the opposite direction. Let me hand off to Daniel though.
Yeah, I guess it's a great question because it does point to a tension in a way between what Steve said and what I said. And I mean, we sort of often talking about this and trying to figure this out. So I have two thoughts. One is kind of more serious and one is more of a joke, I guess. But the first one is, there may be something about being reliant on counter-majoritarian institutions for your survival that actually makes you more fearful. And as sort of paradoxical as that sounds. I mean, that would be interesting, to have more kind of a psychological account of this, in the sense that, if you build a wall around your house and put an alarm system in your house, rather than feeling more secure, you actually start to get more nervous. There's some way in which the vulnerability of that position makes one more alert to the precariousness of it in a way, and so makes you more fearful. I mean, if that's possible, that does challenge the normal view is these counter-majoritarian institutions are there to kind of assuage the fears of potential losers. But is it possible actually having those, relying on those, makes one realize that at any moment the walls could be breached and you're finished? So that's one thought. I haven't quite worked that out. I don't know if that's a viable kind of psychological model of fear in a way. A second point is, I kind of get frustrated with this contention, and I mean, I've sort of had this argument with Republican friends who say, oh yeah, if you get rid of the filibuster or the electoral college, Republicans are really going to lose their minds. And I sort of think, well, okay, so what is it that's going to happen? What, will raid the Congress? I mean, we're already at that point, and so it's not clear to me what it is where we are sort of trying to protect and to save. I guess, could be more violent. Things could always be worse. But my sense, in a sense, following up on Steve's point, is that there's already this incredible fear and this radicalization given our current situation. And so, it's not, and so I guess the way forward, I mean, there's two models forward, and this is kind of this tension within the Biden's public rhetoric, as well as kind of what's actually viable. I mean, one idea is that, what you need to do, there's this court reform commission that he has put together, right? Everybody has forgotten about that now. Democrats do have a majority in the Senate. They could, expand the size of the court. Nobody's talking about that. Maybe that's a good thing. So I hesitate even to bring it up. But, it could be you could have a bipartisan effort to reform the courts. That's like one model of like how this change happens. This mass, bring together some, Mitt Romney and, Lisa Murkowski, and come up with a solution that appeals to everybody and make these reforms sort of that everybody can buy into. That's one model. The second model is just force the stuff through. And that's sort of what's, I think, happening right now. I mean, that's a bet what Chuck Schumer is trying to do. So, I'm not sure which is the better strategy, but these are two different ways forward.
Yeah, and the Republicans certainly forced change through with gerrymandering and a lot of other things. So, yeah. Okay, another set of questions for each of you by Angelo Chrysogelos. So to Prof. Levitsky, you said, democracy means that you accept you lost. Do you think this applied to Democrats after 2016 election and the Russiagate and similar claims? My perception of America is that for a growing percentage of Democrats, no Republican president will be legitimate any more than a damn president would be for Republicans. Isn't this a problem? And then from Prof. Ziblatt, you comment about how the state electoral college and Supreme Court favor the minority runs against the experience of the EU, where our problem is illiberalism, i.e. the emasculation of democratic institution in the name of popular electoral majority, for instance, Hungary. Wouldn't any recommendation to weaken counter-majority institutions be illiberal in the literal sense of the word? And how does this square with the historical experience in Europe that conservative parties buy into democracy only under liberal guarantees against popular majority? Wouldn't it only radicalize Republicans more? Thank you.
So on the first question, didn't the Democrats not accept Trump's victory in 2016? Of course they accepted Trump's victory in 2016. Hillary Clinton congratulated Trump early the next morning. President Obama congratulated Trump, invited him to the White House. The entire Democratic Party leadership, without exception, recognized Trump's victory immediately and moved towards a transition. Did they gripe about Russia? Yes, they did. But in fact, there was a bipartisan investigation in the US Senate. The Senate Intelligence Committee found that, in fact, there was Russian interference in the election. Do we know if it was decisive? We'll never know if it was decisive. It was an incredibly close election. We cannot know whether it was decisive, but what did Russia try to influence the 2016 election in Trump's favor? Without question. Senator Burr of North Carolina, Republican, will agree with the Democrats that the Russians tried. There's good evidence of that. So that was not a fiction or something made up. But more importantly, despite that, Democrats converged in accepting that Donald Trump, they didn't like Donald Trump, but they accepted that he was the legitimately elected president of the United States. I'll remind you, they did not storm the Capitol. They did not refuse to recognize that Donald Trump had won the election. They did not remain silent for 1, 2, 4, 8 weeks after the election and refuse to grant him the legitimacy of the presidency. None of that happened. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So, and on the question about the counter-majority, again, I think, this is a little bit of a misunderstanding of the argument that I'm trying to make. Certainly minority rights need to be protected. I'm not calling for the abolishment of the Bill of Rights. I'm not saying we should get rid of judicial review. This is how individual rights are protected. It's about individual rights as the main point. This fear of majority. I guess the point also about the question with the references to Viktor Orban is, well, can't somebody come into power, have an illiberal majoritarian comes into power and dismantles the protections of individual rights of citizens. I guess my reaction to that is a bit that there's really very little evidence anywhere, including the example of Adolf Hitler, of majorities winning and overrunning minorities. What happens is you have electoral institutions in place that exaggerate the importance of minorities or very small majorities into supermajorities. And so the case of Hungary is really a clear example of this, where you didn't have a supermajority of the electorate supporting Orban. It's that you had an electoral system that elevated the importance of the majority into a supermajority so that it could change the constitution. And so it's exactly the kinds of institutions that exaggerate the influence of smaller groups into extra, so I find this to be analogous to Republicans without a majority, popular majority, being able to claim the presidency because of the electoral college. And so I think the point is majority rule. My sense is that in a way that with the whole discourse around populism, in some ways we've, in many instances, have over exaggerated the fear we ought to have of majorities. In the United States, I think majorities, as I said earlier, are pretty liberal, pretty inclusive on racial questions, on a whole lot of questions. And the biggest threat to our democracies is actually minorities who use their minority status to govern majorities through institutions that exaggerate their role. So that's kind of the sort of general take I have on this.
Okay. Is this a preview of your next book?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll conclude with a question for the two of you who are dedicated and inspiring teachers. It's a question from Claire Putnam, one of the staff members of the Weatherhead Center. She asked, how can an institution like Harvard encourage the mostly liberal student body to broaden their conversations so that they are having conversation with conservative students if they can't find them? The problem with liberal echo chambers on college campus, how would you address it? Adam Stella wrote a piece in Boston Globe in late December about how liberal students are silencing conservative views rather than listening, which does not prepare them for the real world. So what are your views on this?
We should have had Sheri here still, because there would have been a little bit more disagreement maybe between Steve and I and Sheri. But anyway, I don't know, Steve, do you want to say something?
Oh, you're passing the ball back to me?
Yes, yeah, that was.
Look,
I said something in the past.
It's a serious problem. I think it's often somewhat flawed to blame the universities and the professors for an underlying demographic and sociological phenomenon, which is that universities are increasingly populated by urban secular folks, and just like the army is increasingly populated by Republicans, there is a process of self-segregation that's really troubling, deeply problematic, but it's an underlying structural process that's not easy to revert. But I think, Claire, you're absolutely right that university officials and professors need to be aware of that and need to continue to teach critical thinking and debate, which these days means critical thinking maybe first and foremost, maybe in social, at least in social sciences, involves teaching liberal kids from Cambridge, Massachusetts, about conservative, maybe religious, maybe free market views, forcing our students to confront views that they didn't grow up with and that their friends don't necessarily espouse. We would like, it would be nice, and even when I was in college, Dana and I were in college, it wasn't that hard to land on a college campus and encounter a diversity of views. There's still a diversity of views at Harvard, but it's true. Sort of the illiberal right, which is very important in US politics, is very, very poorly represented on elite college campuses in particular. So we need to make an effort to foster debate. We need to bring in people that make our progressive students uncomfortable, and not necessarily, I'm not talking about Charles Murray. I'm talking about more legitimate thinkers and conservatives. There are many really smart conservatives that our students ought to be engaging with. It doesn't have to be Charles Murray. Let me stop there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, but mostly agree with it, except, I mean, part of it is also admissions and, what kinds of I'm sure the admissions office tries to seek out people from different parts of the country. I'm sure just as they seek out people from different parts of the world. And I would actually argue that, it's important to seek out diversity within the US, but it's also important to seek out diversity across the world, because in some ways this kind of left-right dichotomy that we have in the US, that's in some sense, that's not the world, right? I mean, you talk to students from all around the world, there's going to be all sorts of cross-cutting issues. And so I think actually being aware of those divisions within the United States among our student body, as well as broader divisions, I think both of those are sort of part of the same thing of having a broader, more diverse set of angles on questions that people care about.
Yeah,
that's an excellent point.
Yeah, and the students sorting themselves to Duke and Dartmouth when they're more conservative is a problem. I want to signal the work of the sociologist Amy Binder, who has studied the political life of students on conservative campuses. If you want to follow this up, she does extremely interesting work, political sociology among college students. Well, we're going to wrap this up. I want to thank Steve and Dan, as well as our other speakers. When I read How Democracy Dies, I was so taken by the way in which you explain all the background conditions that made Trump possible, and great social science is about studying conditions of possibilities. So you've done a wonderful job in your previous work, and now you're giving us the tool to understand better what may be ahead of us. So thank you for enlightening us. I'm extremely grateful for your participation. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I invite you to the next session in 2 weeks around meritocracy with Michael Sandels, Stefan Mao, and Jonathan Misch. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
And thank you also to the